When people talk about WWF's Golden Era, they usually think of the legendary names plastered all over posters, magazines, and old VHS tapes. But behind that spotlight was another layer of wrestlers, the quiet faces, rarely mentioned, some of whom have passed away without many modern fans ever knowing. They might have only worked the mid-card, made the stars look good, or disappeared after a few TV appearances, but each of them carried their own bittersweet story. Today, we're turning back the clock to remember them. Let's get started. Wrestling Sphere, go! 1. SD, Special Delivery, Jones. In the memories of many WWF fans from the Golden Era, SD, Special Delivery Jones is the kind of face you always saw on your TV screen, but rarely stopped to really think about. He was the textbook 80s babyface. Friendly smile, quick footwork, always clapping and hyping up the crowd even when he was about to get beaten to a pulp himself. Jones usually showed up early on the card, kicking off the show with a short, high-energy match. The kind of bout that warmed the crowd up and got them ready for the bigger stars later in the night. He was never the guy on the poster, but he was that familiar spice in the mix. Take him away, and the whole wrestling feast would feel a little less fun. For a lot of people, Special Delivery's clearest highlight is his appearance at WrestleMania 1. While the whole world was focused on Hogan, Mr. T, or Andre, Jones quietly did his job, walking down the aisle at Madison Square Garden as a representative of the blue-collar babyfaces, the guys who were never booked as legends, but helped make the event look bigger, busier, and more alive. He was the kind of wrestler that, if you were a kid back then, you'd cheer for almost automatically, even though you pretty much knew he was going to lose. Away from the spotlight, Conrad Ephraim's life was much quieter. Once he stepped away from the ring, his name slowly got buried under wave after wave of new generations. Fresh faces kept showing up, and Special Delivery was pushed into that hazy corner of memory where people only vaguely recall that guy who used to open the shows. Because of that, not many fans even realized he'd passed away. In 2008, back home in Antigua, Jones died of a stroke at the age of 63. It was a quiet ending to a career that was never loud to begin with. But if you look back at the WWF Golden Era, you'll realize that guys like SD Jones were quietly carrying a piece of that era's soul on their shoulders. Wrestlers who didn't need the main event, who were happy to play the lovable loser, and still managed to earn a lot of affection from the people in the seats. 2. Big Bully Busick. Among the familiar but hard-to-place faces of early 90s WWF, Big Bully Busick was the kind of character you could dislike on sight. Thick, old-school mustache, stocky build, bowler hat, cigar in his mouth, vest and suspenders. Busick looked like a bully who had just walked straight out of an old comic strip. That was exactly what WWF wanted fans to feel. This was the guy who picked on the weak, someone who existed purely so the audience could hate his guts. Before he ever stepped into a WWF ring, Busick had spent years grinding in the territories, known for a rough, hard-hitting style. Not flashy, not pretty, but very real. When he joined WWF, he was boxed into the role of the neighborhood thug, snarling in the ring, and at ringside constantly picking fights, trash-talking the crowd, especially women and kids in the front row. Those little bully segments were always designed so that when a babyface finally showed up, the fans would explode, feeling that extra sense of satisfaction watching Busick get what he deserved. In the ring, Big Bully Busick didn't rely on high-flying or slick technique. He used his weight, basic holds, stomps, elbow drops. Everything looked heavy, mean, and uncomfortable, exactly what you'd expect from a street tough who enjoys wearing opponents down. For a while, he was managed by Harvey Whippleman, which made the act look even more slimy and unlikable. But for all that, his run in WWF was surprisingly short. In an era overflowing with loud, over-the-top gimmicks, Busick's more grounded, real-world bully persona didn't get much time or big programs, and he left the company without a memorable feud or career-defining moment. After WWF, Big Bully Busick wrestled here and there before slowly stepping away from the spotlight and settling into a calmer life outside the ring. Many years later, a lot of fans were caught off guard when they learned he had passed away in 2018, at the age of 63, after a long battle with illness. Big Bully Busick might not be a headline name in wrestling history, but for anyone who watched WWF in that period, the image of that scowling bully with a bowler hat and cigar is still a piece of memory that's very hard to shake. 3. Moondog Spot. In the memories of WWF fans from the Golden Era, the Moondogs were always one of the strangest tag teams ever to walk out from behind the curtain. In an age of muscle-bound heroes with slicked back hair and polished looks, Moondog Spot showed up looking like he'd just crawled out of a back alley, messy beard and hair, gear that looked thrown together, and a giant bone in his hand like he'd dragged it straight out of a cave. He didn't look like a modern pro wrestler. He looked like a wild creature dropped into the ring. And that raw, dirty, crazy vibe is exactly what made him unforgettable. As the standout member of the Moondogs, Spot and his partners brought a brand of tag team wrestling that was violent and chaotic, with almost no regard for rules. They didn't rely on pretty sequences. What they brought was pure anarchy. Smashing opponents with bones, brawling all over the outside, torn up clothes, guttural growls like hunting animals. And somehow, in a WWF full of colorful characters in the early 80s, that madness helped them stand out. The Moondogs weren't just a weird tag team. They actually reached the top by capturing the WWF Tag Team Championship, proving that a gimmick that looked like a joke on paper could still claw its way to gold. What made Moondog Spot special was how completely he lived his character. When the bell rang, he charged into the fight like a rabid dog defending its territory, but buried in all that chaos was a very sharp sense of timing. He knew how to drag the crowd into the match, when to suffer and sell a beating, and when to explode so the entire arena would erupt. He was never the type of star you plastered all over posters, but every time the Moondogs showed up, you recognized them instantly, and that kind of imprint is something not everyone can leave behind. Tragically, Spot's life ended in the very place he'd spent his career, the ring. In 2003, during a match in Memphis, he suffered a heart attack while performing. Under the lights, with the ropes around him and the fans still cheering, the heart of that wild dog stopped beating at just 51 years old. There was no big media campaign, no grand video tribute packages, just one more name that quietly slipped away. But for those who grew up watching that crazy man with the giant bones snarling on their TV screens, Moondog Spot will always be one of the wildest, most untamed memories of the WWF Golden Era. 4. Lanny Poffo. Among the many forgotten faces of WWF's Golden Era, Lanny Poffo is the one that makes longtime fans the most nostalgic. A lot of people don't even remember that before he became an insufferable genius on screen, he was actually the real-life younger brother of Macho Man Randy Savage, part of the colorful Poffo family that carved out its own place in American wrestling history. In his early WWF run, he wrestled as Leaping Lanny, a pure babyface. Kind, enthusiastic, and always trying to lift the crowd's spirits. He'd walk to the ring with a scroll in his hand, stand in the center of the ring, and read poems he'd written himself as a gift to the fans. Then he'd toss the rolled-up poems into the audience like little souvenirs. His in-ring style leaned on agility, springing off the ropes, flying attacks, and smooth rolling transitions instead of brute force, making him feel different in an era dominated by muscle-bound heavyweights. However, Lanny Poffo is truly remembered for his complete transformation into the genius. From a likable hero, he reinvented himself as a smug intellectual, wearing a graduation gown and mortarboard, strutting to the ring with a crooked, superior smile. As the genius, he still recited poetry, but now it was to belittle his opponents and mock the idiots in front of him. His drawn-out delivery and pompous, lecture-like tone made the character both hilarious and infuriating, the exact kind of heel fans loved to boo. As the genius, he also worked as a manager for Mr. Perfect and the Beverly Brothers, constantly interfering in matches, taking bumps for his men, and creating plenty of memorable TV moments. Even though he never became a main event act or world champion, Lanny Poffo remained a unique piece of the WWF Golden Era, a time when every character had a distinct flavor. In 2023, Lanny Poffo passed away in New York due to heart failure at the age of 68. For many longtime fans, the news felt like a quiet closing of a chapter, as if a small part of those childhood nights spent watching WWF had slipped away with him. 5. Outlaw Ron Bass. In the sea of colorful characters from the WWF Golden Era, Outlaw Ron Bass was the kind of villain you could identify at a glance. This guy was trouble. A true cowboy heel, with a wide-brimmed hat, thick facial hair, cold eyes, and a leather whip always in hand. Just his look alone screamed, this man just walked out of a rough saloon in the Wild West, ready to start a fight with anyone who stared a second too long. Inside the ring, Ron Bass didn't rely on high-flying moves or slick technical sequences. His style was raw and punishing. Every punch, every stomp felt like an attempt to drive his opponent through the mat. His matches carried a constant sense of danger, as if one wrong move could send things completely off the rails. The whip wasn't just a prop, it was an extension of his persona, a symbol of cruelty, intimidation, and his love of dishing out punishment in front of a live crowd. In the late 80s, Outlaw Ron Bass entered a heated feud with Brutus, the Barber Beefcake, one of the most violent and unsettling rivalries for many fans of that era. Sneak attacks, gang beatdowns, blood on the canvas. Their segments left viewers both fired up and slightly shaken. The image of Bass relentlessly going after Beefcake, doing everything he could to ruin him, burned itself into the memories of those who watched back then, even if later on it was rarely highlighted again on TV or in official retrospectives. He never captured any major championships, but Outlaw Ron Bass embodied that old-school heel archetype perfectly. He didn't need long promos. Just walking out, glaring, and throwing hands was enough to make the crowd absolutely despise him. He was the kind of villain people bought tickets to see get what he deserved. In 2017, Ron Bass passed away at 68 years old due to complications following surgery for a ruptured appendix. It was a quiet end for a man who once brought genuine menace to the ring. For nostalgic fans, the name Outlaw Ron Bass might not be mentioned often anymore, but whenever they think back to late 80s WWF, the image of that cowboy with the whip still appears vividly in their minds. 6. Black Bart. In the larger picture of the WWF Golden Era, Black Bart stands out as a textbook old-school cowboy. Standing around 6 feet 4 inches, weighing over 300 pounds, with a wide frame and thick beard, he looked exactly like someone who had just pushed open the swinging doors of a dusty western bar. Before arriving in WWE in early 1990, Bart had already spent more than 15 years grinding through the territories, teaming with Ron Bass as the Long Riders and picking up several notable titles, including a run as World-Class Championship Wrestling Heavyweight Champion in Dallas. The problem was timing. By the time WWE called, Bart was already 41, an age when most wrestlers are past their physical peak. In the company, he was never slotted into major storylines or given pay-per-view spotlight. Instead, Black Bart typically showed up on smaller shows, dark matches, or bouts that never made TV, where he did rack up some wins over lesser-known names like Paul Diamond and Jim Powers. On television, though, the picture was very different. Bart was usually fed to bigger stars like Dusty Rhodes, Tito Santana, or Tugboat, almost always doing the honors to make them look stronger in the eyes of the audience. That steady presence without any real breakout moment caused Black Bart's name to fade quickly among the brighter characters of the era. In early 1991, he left WWE quietly. No farewell angle, no memorable final send-off. For fans who loved that old-fashioned rugged style of wrestling, it felt like a missed opportunity. A big, experienced cowboy who never received a true push from Vince McMahon. After WWE, Bart kept working in other promotions. One of his few later highlights often brought up is his surprise appearance in WCW in 1995 at the World War III event, entering the 60-man Battle Royal for the World Heavyweight title under the name Big Train Bart. In 2025, Black Bart passed away, bringing to a close the journey of a tough cowboy who had quietly carved out his place in wrestling's golden era. 7. Mark Young. On the list of WWF Golden Era names that modern fans rarely think about, Mark Young is a pretty unique case. He wasn't just some guy who flashed on TV for a moment and then vanished. He was the adopted son of legend Chief Jay Strongbow, one of WWF's big icons in the 70s and 80s. In other words, Mark stepped into the business carrying both a massive shadow behind him and quiet expectations from those who knew he was second generation. Properly trained and having gone through harsh environments like Stu Hart's famous training camp, Mark Young started wrestling in the mid-80s and began popping up here and there in WWF. It wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that he had a more consistent run on TV. Dressed in patriotic gear, Mark was presented as a young, energetic babyface, usually working opening matches. He picked up a few wins over names familiar to hardcore fans, the usual jobbers or mid-carders, just enough for viewers to recognize his face, but never enough to push him into true star territory. Mark Young's problem was timing. He came into WWF during a period when the roster was stacked and competition was brutal. The occasional house show wins weren't enough to turn him into a TV star, and on television he was often slotted as the guy who tested newly pushed heels or served as a backdrop for bigger names. Slowly, he slid into the mold of classic enhancement talent, someone the crowd recognized, but almost no one was actively waiting to see in the next match. After a few short stints, bouncing between different promotions, he quietly retired in the early 90s, barely in his 20s. What makes Mark Young's story even more bittersweet is how early he passed away. In 2016, he died at just 48 years old, with no clear cause of death publicly announced. To many, His name is just another small line on the long list of wrestlers who have passed on. But to the fans who followed WWF in that era, Mark Young is still remembered as the young babyface who tried to step out of his legendary father's shadow, even if he never quite made it into the main spotlight. 8. Super Ninja. In the world of pro wrestling, there are faces that only flicker across TV for a moment, yet still leave a hazy memory behind. Super Ninja is one of those, a mysterious character that few fans realize was actually Rip Oliver, a Portland veteran who spent most of his career working the small arenas of the Pacific Northwest. Before he came to the WWF, Oliver was already a seasoned wrestler, a multiple-time regional champion. His rare moment on nationwide television came in November 1988 on an episode of Saturday Night's Main Event, when, under the guidance of Mr. Fuji, Rip put on an all-black masked outfit and became Super Ninja, a dark, oriental assassin type of character tailored exactly to what American fans were used to seeing back then. That night, Super Ninja was thrown straight onto national TV to challenge the Intercontinental Champion, the Ultimate Warrior, essentially as the sacrificial opponent meant to showcase Warrior's dominance. The match ended quickly, but the image of a masked veteran taking every bump, selling every move on cue, and doing his job to make the champion look unstoppable kept him from being completely lost in the shuffle. Few people remember that before that, in late 1987, Rip Oliver had already appeared in the WWF under his real name, usually matched up against big stars like Randy Savage or even Warrior himself. He almost never won on TV, but thanks to the reputation he'd built in Portland, he remained a familiar presence on local shows. Ironically, after a career stacked with regional titles, what sticks in most people's minds about Rip Oliver is just that brief run as Super Ninja. The character showed up once and vanished, turning him into a kind of ghost of the Golden Era. In 2020, Rip Oliver passed away quietly, with barely a mention, leaving Super Ninja to drift on in the fading memories of the few nostalgic fans who still remember him. 9. Iron Mike Sharpe. In the memories of so many WWF fans from the Golden Era, there's always this big, dark-haired guy with an arm brace, stomping around the ring and growling non-stop. He was almost always the one taking the loss, but he showed up so often that it felt like every time you turned on the TV, he was there. That was Iron Mike Sharpe, jokingly called Canada's greatest athlete, and one of the most legendary jobbers WWF ever had. Sharpe was never the type of star the company built around. In fact, his role was crystal clear. Go on TV and make the top guys look cooler and more dominant by taking their offense, bumping all over the place, and losing in convincing fashion. But the way he did it was completely unique. Wherever Mike Sharpe moved, he was yelling. He'd hit the ropes and yell, take a move and yell, crash to the mat and still be growling, creating this chaotic wall of noise that you just couldn't forget. Fans only had to hear that sound to know, oh, Mike Sharpe's on TV again. His familiar image was that simple black gear and the forearm brace, something a lot of fans back then saw as a kind of secret weapon he always used to deal damage. Even though he almost never got to enjoy victory on television, his career on the house show circuit wasn't as flat as people might think. He had longer matches, and sometimes he even beat mid-card opponents, just enough for anyone who'd followed him from the start to see that he was a skilled worker, not just a punching bag that screams. Sharpe's biggest success wasn't in titles, but in how often he appeared from the mid-80s to the early 90s. For the generation that grew up with WWF in that era, even if they forget a lot of names, they can easily recall Canada's greatest athlete, with that harsh yelling and the permanently strained expression on his face. He was the kind of character that, if you take him out, the Golden Era picture loses a very distinct shade of color. In his final years, Mike Sharpe lived a very low-key life, almost completely stepping away from the spotlight and the noise of the wrestling world. He passed away in 2016 in Canada at the age of 64. He left quietly, but the image of that legendary jobber with the arm brace and those gravelly growls still lives on in the memories of anyone who ever loved the WWF Golden Era. 10. Bam Bigelow. When you talk about faces that could shock WWF fans at first sight during the Golden Era, Bam Bigelow is absolutely on that list. In an environment filled with giants and muscle-bound monsters, he still stood out in his own way, a shaved head covered in flaming tattoos, a body weighing well over 400 pounds, yet moving with unreal agility. The moment his music hit and Bam walked out, you knew right away, this was not some filler wrestler there just to make up the numbers. What made Bam special wasn't just that comic book villain look, it was what he could do in the ring. things a man his size simply shouldn't be capable of. He could climb to the top rope and hit a moonsault that blew the roof off the building. To many fans, Bam Bam felt like a flying monster, a mix of super heavyweight power and cruiserweight athleticism. When he arrived in WWF in the late 80s, Bam Bam was presented as a real threat to every top star on the roster. He teamed up with, and later clashed against, some of the biggest names of that time, worked huge multi-man matches, and was often the focal point whenever he was in the ring. Even if he wasn't always slotted in the main event, any match with Bam Bam in it almost guaranteed at least one moment that made the crowd gasp. After his WWF run, Bigelow continued to roam through other promotions, keeping that same intense, sometimes downright brutal style. He was the kind of wrestler that, no matter where he showed up, all it took was one camera shot for people to say, "Oh, that's Bam Bam Bigelow." Among insiders, he's consistently ranked as one of the most technically sound and surprisingly agile big men in wrestling history. But like many stars of his generation, life outside the ring was anything but easy. Years of accumulated injuries, a hard lifestyle, and the brutal tempo of the business wore his body down faster than age alone. Bam Bam Bigelow passed away in 2007, barely in his 40s, leaving behind a lot of sadness and what-ifs for fans, especially those who watched him tear it up during WWF's glory days. If you enjoyed these stories about forgotten wrestlers, don't forget to drop a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and hit subscribe to Wrestling Sphere so we've got the motivation to bring you even more videos like this.